Just welcome to all of you. This is part of the series of Church Outside the Walls, which, as those of you who know who've been with us, for all or for some, is a year-long event that's taking place in collaboration with the Faculty of Divinity at Trinity College. We are delighted you can come and join us tonight. One of the things that we'd always hoped about Church Outside the Walls by having a series of conversations over a year was that we could respond or insert events as they happened, and this is exactly one of those in a very busy time for a lot of clergy, in a very busy year for our guests. It has we were able to pull this together thanks to both to Don and to Hannah, graciously working with their schedules. So this is what we're calling a bonus event. It will be recorded tonight, and so if you can't, or you know people who wanted to, if you know people who weren't able to sign on, it will be shortly available through the Trinity College website. That we'll send you out a notice. So just a couple of things, because this is a smaller and it's going to be a more cozier, a more conversational type of event. We are going to just leave everybody's screens up. It's not going to be a webinar. We would ask just to help in hearing and with people's bandwidth that you of course mute during when others are speaking. And there will be a time near the end where we'll open it up for questions from all of you. So do hang on if there's something that you'd like to ask either Hannah or Dawn. And I think with that, we're just going to jump in. I should acknowledge that there are people gathered here from all over Turtle Island, and we acknowledge and are grateful to the caretakers of those lands. So first of all, I'm going to go in least importance. It's going to be like a procession into church. So the least will be first. Jeffrey Reddy, who is Director of Orthodox Studies and a faculty member of Father Jeffrey Reddy at Trinity College, and I will be asking questions over the bulk of the night. And so you'll hear our voices quite often. But we really want to hear the voices of our two guests, Father Don Beyers and the Rev'd Hannah Johnston, who are incumbent and associate. I don't know what your title is, Hannah. It's associate at St. Anne's.
I'm a curate.
Curate. All right.
Anne's, yeah.
Just got a promotion. But the curate at St. Anne's, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about the last year, almost year. This is a special event, not only because these are two people who are close to our group, to the faculty, and to the Church Outside the Walls series. It's special because that's where this Church Outside the Walls year began, with that really fabulous event when we were so graciously and wonderfully hosted at St. Anne's a year ago, May. And it was just, we were just talking, it was a short while. We were there, and Hannah was priested, and sadly the fire occurred just after that. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey, but I think the question we all want to know, first of all, is how are you guys? How are you doing?
Well, I have to say the thing that I personally have learned in this is taking every day, day by day. If there's been any exercise in all of this, is having to approach each day as it comes and to be present, I guess, with everyone's sort of spiritual and emotional well-being at this time. I mean, many of you know, just having worked with people who have gone through trauma, the emotions and the feelings and the spirituality literally ebb and flow. It's up and down. Some weeks are stronger. It's hard when you're standing always and looking at some ruins. So I think for all of us, I think it's every day is sort of a new reality, so to say. There's excitement, it's both a mix of excitement and a wonder, but at the same time, I have to say there are challenging moments. They can be difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. It's definitely been 9 months of ups and downs. And I think for me, after the initial first few weeks, which were so kind of traumatic and chaotic and full on, I'm the kind of person who uh, sort of looks on the bright side and looks for the silver lining and is always kind of, oh, I'm fine, everything's good. But I think it's been a learning experience that these things, you don't just get over them straight away. And even when it feels like life has returned to a more normal pattern, and it should be okay, it sort of comes back and surprises you, both I think with my own trauma from the day and the days that followed, but also in congregants, in parishioners, that unexpectedly grief or anger will kind of bubble up, even months later. So yeah, it's a learning experience for sure.
If I might add, I really appreciate what Hannah said, because I think I share very much a similar experience to Hannah in this, that the emotions of everything really didn't hit until, for me at least, a few months after the fire. Because I think we were just in such I know for both of us, we were just going, I mean, there were days that were 12, 15-hour days, and just trying to respond and trying to be present. And I have to say, my partner one night, he called me out on it, and he said, you haven't shown any emotion on this. And it hit me at that point, because I think it's an adrenaline rush. And you know how I'll speak about the cycle of grief, and the reality is, Hannah's totally right. And I know most therapists agree with us today, that things don't simply follow a pattern. It's like a zigzag. You get one day where you're feeling relief, and another day where you suddenly feel this heaviness coming over you. So it's trying to find stability in that, and grace in that as well.
Thank you so much both for being with us this evening. So as Mary Kate mentioned, back in May, we launched a year of events conceived as Church Outside the Walls. We thought that was a really exciting theme that would get us energized about thinking about the church in the world today. We didn't think anybody would take it quite so literally as you have done. So I guess I kind of want to know, how has this whole experience changed your way of thinking about the church? How has the lack of a physical building impacted the community, the way you work with it, that sort of thing?
I guess I like how Hannah and I both look at each other trying to decide who goes first. um, it's had a very profound impact for me on the way I perceive church. On one hand, I had to give complete credit to my predecessor, Gary Vandermeer. He did an excellent job when he was here, and really connecting the church to the community. And I think the days and weeks after the fire, and even to this present moment, what I realize is, we can't simply see the church as simply locked within a physical place, that the church has an impact that extends well beyond the walls. And the pastoral care, for example, I used to say when I came here that I'm a pastor for everybody in this region, regardless if they're Anglican or not. I'm the pastor to all. And that became real for me in my ministry in the months and weeks after. And in fact, today I got a note from a neighbor about an issue. So I think it's broadened my sense of church. It's also given greater meaning to the church being the people. And I know theologically this may sound cliche, but it really has reaffirmed for me that whole notion that the church is more than the building. It's more than the walls. It's the people of God. And how do we come together, and how do we pray and worship in a very liminal space as well? And I'll just finish with this. There was a comment from a friend of mine. He's actually Roman Catholic, works at the Roman Catholic Cathedral here. And he came to Mass one Sunday, and he spoke about, as celebrants, we don't always get the sense, you don't know how people are reacting to worship. Sometimes it's like a teacher. You can't always gauge what are people getting out of this. But he was standing in back in one of the rows in our hall, and he said he felt this profound sense of holy, even though we're in this auditorium that doesn't feel holy. You know what I mean? It doesn't have that classic sense of sacred in the same way that, say, the church did. But he said he was listening and watching people during the liturgy, and he found this profound sense of prayer. So I think understanding, it's really reaffirmed for me the whole notion that all of creation is holy, and how we celebrate the sacred within creation, whether outdoors or in this liminal space, can be just as equally profound experience as, say, something as grand as St. Anne's was in the past.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is that we're extremely lucky as a church that we had an enormous parish hall with an almost full-size theatre inside of it, right next to the church. And obviously most churches do not have that luxury, that resource. And so although that's been a difficult move in terms of trying to make a creaky old building a little bit more accessible and more welcoming, I think I felt very lucky that we were able to do that move really quite smoothly within a couple of weeks. We had 1 week where we were literally without walls, worshipping in the parking lot with Bishop Kevin. And then the following week, we were able to move into the parish hall. And so I think it would have been a very different experience if we'd had to uproot and move to a different location. And there were so many wonderful kind offers from churches around the neighborhood of using their space. But I think it's been really important to stay on, on the plot, on the site. As Don said, seeing the church ruin it every day is difficult. And yet I think it's an important witness to the neighborhood that we're still there, and that the church continues even without that particular building. The church is still a church. The church is still in the neighborhood. The church is still present. And so I think that's been really important. And it's been really interesting. Obviously, St. Anne's was a very particular space, and it was very well suited to that kind of cathedral style worship. And yet, we had like 70 people rattling around in a building that could hold like 900. And so it feels more intimate in worshiping the parish hall, and it has much less of a formal vibe to it. And when you're preaching to people, you can, see into their eyes rather than people sitting all the way at the back in a giant building. And so I think there's been some benefits in that, in the midst of all the upheaval. And the other thing I think that I really noticed, particularly in the weeks following the fire, when we weren't able to get back into our office building. And so Don and I were working in a coffee shop for a number of weeks, working from home. But, every time we had a pastoral meeting, we'd be in this coffee shop. And the coffee shop folks knew us already, but just the relationship that developed there, they were constantly giving us free coffees, wouldn't let us pay for anything, letting us take over their space for hours on end. There was one day when a week or so after the fire, when Don and I were sitting there together, and we both started crying at one point in our meeting. And I thought, how weird must this look to have two priests sitting there in our collars in a coffee shop, holding hands and crying. But it was just, I think it showed me. We talk a lot in the church about ministering to the community and ministering to the neighborhood. But in those weeks, I really felt like the neighborhood ministered to us, and they were almost providing pastoral care to us, just by acts of kindness and, coming by on a daily basis and offering support. And both our emails were overwhelmed with offers of support from around the neighborhood, the country, and the world. And so that that was really noticeable for me, I think, especially in the weeks immediately following the fire.
I'd have to add, I appreciate Hannah shared that, because I have to add, the word that comes to my mind is it really did feel incarnational. We were, grace, I'm not trying to sound so theological here, but the best way I can describe it was grace was thriving in a very real and tangible way with people. And it still is. And I think those moments in the cafe, and still when I go to the cafe, I still get offers of free coffee, and they also serve beer. So that's a nice little occasional, benefit as well. But to meet, again, to see the church go beyond the walls is a powerful effect. Like I would get young adults come up to me and start talking to me about faith and theology. But it was also cute in a way that they were coming up to me and saying, "Well, how are you, Father Don? Are you okay?" And I thought, well, that's deeply touching, because so often I think in ministry we have an imbalance sometimes. And we speak of this even when we talk about our screening processes in the church. Uh, but here, what I found, it was a mutuality in a way that I've never, both with the people who worship with us and who participate here, but in the community as well, that it was a shared experience. And still is, I'd say, a shared experience. I don't want to give a past tense here. It's still very much going on.
It's lovely to hear that, and the experience of that must be, just as you've already said a couple of times, profound. And so obviously, and not jumping ahead to thinking about what's next or what the future is, because you're still very much living in the now, and the reconciling or the understanding or the finding yourselves in this new space. But with the involvement and with this partnership, this whole all in of the community, um, how has that shaped your vision of what St. Anne's will be? And that may be an evolving question, but how is that coming together as you think forward?
I might jump in here first, because I have to say this is really a process that's being led by our parish community. We are very fortunate. We were very fortunate in the days after the fire to have Roberto Chiotti, who was the funding architect of Larkin Architecture, come with us. And if you know of him, he and his firm had built a number of churches and have restored a number of churches as well over his time. So Roberto brought in expertise, and he's really offered a great guidance to the wardens, to myself, Hannah, in trying to lead. But what has emerged out of that, and it's really quite profound, it's almost, pardon the expression, it's eerie sometimes how when we bring together this group of lay people who are part of the parish, and they reflect the diversity and the age range of the parish, what's so chilling in it is that there are things that are naturally arising. And one of them is that this church has to be faithful. Whatever we build, whatever we do here, has to reflect the diversity of this community. And it also has to incorporate, because this area, if some of you may know, this part of Toronto is a very a center of the arts. A number of emerging artists who are in this area, and the arts have played a very important role in this community. So we're thinking about, how do the arts play in? How do we incorporate our work around truth and reconciliation, because there's a number of Indigenous persons in this community as well, and that's been an important role here too. So even looking, the committee, the discernment committee, has been really quite thoughtful, and they set out some principles that we want to use to guide us going forward. But these principles are really centered around, this has to reflect the diversity of the community, and it has to be a space that's open to the community. And again, rethinking how you design a church. So, I mean, personally, I have found that as beautiful as St. Anne's was, the difficulty with that building is when you stood outside, it looked like a fortress. And even more so, you had a metal fence in front. Well, that doesn't communicate welcome or inclusivity. And for many people, we would have people that say they thought it was a synagogue. It was very hard for them to discern what that building was. So the committee's actually been very mindful to say, we want to work with the local community. We want to engage local artists in this work, but we want to be sure that this building reflects the parish's commitment to being open to the community, and that the church is a church for all people. It's a church for the world, and it's a space where people can come together, and for multiple purposes and reasons as well.
Yeah, I would agree. As Don said, there is a discernment committee made up of parishioners working with the architect, Roberto, which is just in its beginning stages. But what I found really noticeable in the days following the fire, almost instantly, people started asking us, will you rebuild? Will you rebuild? In media interviews, from the following morning. And I think initially, when I talked to people, they were like, oh, we need to rebuild and recreate the paintings and make it exactly as it was. And within days, those ideas were changing. Even just in natural conversations I was having with people were saying things like, well, what could we, what could the church look like that would be different? What could there be, like affordable housing on this space, or could there be underground parking and then more green space rather than having a tarmac parking lot? And could there be new art that reflects Canada today rather than all white men from the 1920s? And so I think that very quickly, very naturally, sort of inspired people's new ideas rather than looking to try to recreate something from the past, and to make a building that serves today's congregation, rather than thousands of people that would come back in the 1920s, and also serves the local community, that is like a community center, a community hub that has facilities that are useful to everyone in the neighborhood, not just folks that happen to come on a Sunday morning. And so I think as the discernment committee continues, that will become more concrete. But those are the ideas that have really been bubbling up, I think, from the parish and from the wider community as well.
Part of the engagement with that wider community and world, certainly in the days, weeks after the fire, was an almost unique opportunity to do theology in the world, right? I mean, I can't actually think of another time in the last couple of decades when on the national news, people were preaching the gospel in the way that was done, by the two of you, really, and the kind of witness that you gave. I wonder what are the kind of theological resources, what are the narratives that really were beginning to resonate with you? Where were the touchstones for the kind of theological reflection that you were essentially doing for yourself and for your community, but also leading the city, the province, the nation, the world through, because you had that kind of unique opportunity to kind of do theological reflection kind of in the round, as it were. Where did you turn?
There are two things that really jump out for me. The first was, actually, they both happened at the vigil that we held a few days afterwards in the Cadbury's parking lot just across from the church. And the first was when Father Don said, we're a resurrection people. We believe in life after death, and this is a death of a building and of a space that was so precious to so many, and yet we know it's not the end. And kind of modeling that even in the fact that we stayed in the neighborhood and didn't move to a different church building. The second one was also at that vigil, where one of our parishioners came up to me and said, St. Anne's was the first place that I heard someone say that to be queer is holy. And that has probably stayed with me more than anything else anybody said over the days and weeks and months that followed. And I think for me, it's because for my faith, that's a very important part of being a Christian in the world, is queering things, queering binaries between right and wrong and sacred and secular and male and female and all kinds of binaries. because I think they're oppressive. And so to be able to be a witness in the world that to be queer is holy, and that there are churches that exist in this world where Christianity is so often associated with oppression and discrimination, I think that's something that I've really held on to about why it's important that St. Anne's as a congregation, as an entity, as a church family continues, because not all churches demonstrate that to people, I guess. So that's been one of the most important things for me.
Two things, I guess, come to my mind. And one was, well, both are rooted, I guess, in my own spiritual formation over the years and theological formation. The first of which is the ecclesiology that I approach. Again, I think when I came here, and it was true in my last parish as well, I have this vision of the church that is broad and welcoming, much to Hannah's point, drawing the world in. And that was, so I came here as COVID was still very much, we were in the depths of COVID. And I got to, chat with a bunch of people who would hang out on our steps. And I realized quickly that there wasn't much space for people to be. And I thought this is an opportunity for the church to be present, to be open, and to be with people in this time, to be with, which I know Sam Wells, often speaks of as well. And so, as Hannah pointed out, it quickly became important for me to say the church does not go because the building isn't there. The church remains. And in fact, the mission of the church, I think, becomes all that much more important. And I remember it was on CBC, the anchor that was interviewing me, she asked me a question at one point. She said, well, what's now? It was as if, we were like the Bay and the store went up and I guess we're not going to be doing anything there. And I said, well, I'm going to go back and stand outside in front of the church. And she gave me this look of shock of, but why? And I thought, because I'm the parish priest. That's my job, is to be present to the community, to pray with them, to listen, to cry with them. And the church has to be with people in this time. And that became a great moment of grace. The other thing that I would say for me was, on a theological and spiritual term, was the whole Paschal mystery. For me in my spirituality, the Paschal mystery plays so very important, because I don't think suffering and death make any sense without the context of life and birth. And I think this is something that we as a church can actually really offer to the world. Now, I had to be sort of clever how I introduced that. I had to say, I went into those interviews at the time. I don't know how Hannah feels, and she can speak to this, but I had to tell you, every interview I'd go in and I think, oh my God, what am I doing here? I mean, I called the diocesan communications person a couple times and I was like, well, so when are you guys going to take it? And he said, oh no, you're doing great. And I thought, oh dear God, I have no idea what I'm saying. And it's a huge pressure when you got all these cameras and you got mics in your ear and you're not really sure what to do. But I found for me, I wanted to offer hope and be genuine about that hope, because our gospel is about hope. It's about life. And it's about being with people and upholding people. And I think we saw this in the pandemic in the years after, that people, yes, we are a very secular society, but let's be honest, when crisis comes, people are looking for meaning and they're looking for hope. And I thought, we have this in our tradition. And it's been very much a part of my life as well, in my spirituality. And I imagine for many of you that, all of us have gone through extraordinary moments of grief and suffering and pain. And those moments are only understood, or for lack of better words, made sense of through the lens of the resurrection, the Paschal mystery. And so I did. Again, I remember I said, well, this isn't the end of our story. We're in Lent right now and we're coming up to Good Friday. Good Friday was not the end. That was just the beginning. And I thought, by being present, by being active, and And I had to say, Hannah is such an extraordinary gift in this, because we both synced at that moment and became, I mean, we've always worked very well together, but it was like, it was a natural role to live in. I think Hannah's presence, even here to me, was a resurrection moment, because there was a witness that, you know, we still believe life. And from the ruins come new life. Hannah mentioned the prayer service, and Bishop Kevin, I don't know if you'll remember this, but there was a point when Bishop Kevin, Reverend Hannah, and I were standing in the parking lot. And what was so striking to me, and I think Bishop Kevin, you noted this, there was a moment where you saw the trees through the ruins. And several people mentioned it was deeply moving during the prayer service. I didn't see it because I had my back to it. But when we went for the moment of silence, so many people later remarked, they said they were so stunned to see these birds flying in and out through the ruins. And it gave them hope. They said it was quite chilling because you see this ruin, and I mean, it was this awful 2 days earlier, and the smell was still very much in the air. But in the face of death, life was flourishing. And so even nature, creation was reminding us that, you know, the Paschal mystery is affirmation of life. And it was coming forward right in this moment. And yeah, to me, it was a profound experience, and it really informed. I clung on to that, and I still cling on to that. I think that's absolutely important. I probably will throughout the rest of my ministry, wherever I'm at, that the resurrection, we are a people of new life, and we affirm life, and we will, even in the face of death and suffering. Yeah.
You've spoken quite often about your theological sort of resources, or where, you know, that you're looking to, and I think in a much you know, I'm remember during lockdown when we all still believed we were going to be back by Easter the first time 5 years ago, that when we hit Easter and when we were walking through Lent, that it was a profound thing, and yet we were in, or could largely see, the buildings that we loved and were attached to and worshipped and gathered in. And your Easter and your Lent liturgies and just the practical, the sort of on the ground, must be incredibly profound. But are particular things that you're drawing on in different ways, or particular things that are helping you set the way that you're walking through these 40 days, and then that the resurrection, the glory of Easter, just which will come very soon before your first anniversary?
So I have to say my approach to Lent has been very different this year, both in my preaching and in my pastoral care. And I think it's partially informed by what we went through here, but also what's going on globally right now and to the south of us. We're living in incredibly anxious times. And my congregation, as Hannah noted earlier, is some of you will relate. You know, when you have a death, you have the shock period, and the death doesn't quite sink in. It's not just, say, 6 months later or 9 months later that you begin to feel the loss. And so I kept hearing in my prayer and in my discernment of the scriptures that this Lent is a time to speak of the compassion of God. And how can we be gentle and kind with one another? Because right now, people are suffering extraordinary. And so I've decided I'm not going the classic Lent themes. In fact, on Sunday, I sort of joked about some of this stuff, you know, how we all go around, you know, talking about our different things that we've given up and our penances and so forth. And I thought, this community doesn't need to go through a penance. They're living a penance. They're living through the valley of darkness and death for these past months. What they need is words of love. And last Sunday, you might recall in the gospel where Jesus has that wonderful line where he says, "Oh, how I wish to gather you under, my wings as a mother hen does with her brood." And I just thought, oh, so that's where I focus on in my preaching, because, I feel God is saying to this community, I want to love you. I want to care for you. I'm with you. I'm walking with you in this time. And that in a sense that all of us are going through our own passion here. And how is God's mercy, God's love present to us in that? And how can we be gentle with each other? Because what has happened in the fire has not only hit people's pain with the loss of a church, but it's also aroused in ways that I was not prepared for. It's also aroused the pain that people feel from past traumas. And that's a part I have to say I was not prepared for in this sort of ministry. And in fact, I think someday seminaries probably would do well to talk about how does past trauma influence people's reaction to present, and how do you pastorally. And Hannah, I don't mean to speak for Hannah, but I know Hannah's particularly felt this in our dialogue. So for me, my experience of Lent, and I decided this is a theme throughout Lent, how to speak of the tender love of God, because the gospel is really about renewing our love of God, our love of each other, and knowing that God actually loves us, that we are good, that we are beautiful, and that God is with us in our suffering. And how do we show compassion, tenderness, and how are we with each other? And yeah, that's really informed me personally, I have to say.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of feels like we've been in Lent since last June, so it'll be interesting to see with spring and hopefully the building having been stabilized and made safe. We're hoping that soon we'll be able to remove the fences that are keeping people a safe distance from the church ruin, and have that open to the public at least for some hours of the day. And so I think I'm hoping personally that as spring and summer come and that becomes a green space that is accessible for people, that will be not a resurrection as such, but that kind of feeling of new life and just a different experience of walking past or walking through or working next to the building every day, that shows some kind of healing and new growth, literally, hopefully, with flowers and grass and blossom and all those kinds of things. So I think I hope that we are coming into more of an Easter season for the congregation.
In the aftermath of something like this, obviously the focus turns to what you don't have, what you're missing, what's gone away. But in reflecting now, 9 months down the line, where have you found abundance? What gifts have you discovered in yourselves, in the community, that have been part of that being able to journey through the valley of the shadow of death, or that Lenten pilgrimage, or whatever? Where are the unexpected or surprise gifts that have come to the fore, where God has shown abundance to the community?
I think the first thing that springs to mind for me is just the offers of help that poured in immediately from other clergy, other churches, people in the neighborhood, people around the country. I lost count of how many people came up to me in the street in the days following the fire saying, I'm an architect, I've driven in from so-and-so, here's my card. Or I'm an expert in art restorer, here's my card. I'm a fire something. Like, there were so many, and our inboxes were also full of offers of help. And just in the, trying to get set up to have worship in the parking lot the following week, I ended up driving around a bunch of different local churches and picking up a processional cross from one, and boxes and boxes of hymn books from another, and We had loans of vestments and decorations, like all sorts of things just poured in, which was amazing. And I think the thing that stands out to me the most was probably a week, 2 weeks after the fire. I was walking back from the coffee shop, having been meeting with congregants there, and I had my collar on, and I don't live far from the church. I'd walked up and down those streets for the previous year wearing my collar and never had anyone seem to notice. And a postal worker ran up to me in the street and said, "Are you the priest at that church that burnt down?" And I said, "Well, yes, I'm one of them." And he said, "I have all your mail." And our office building had been fenced off behind the safety fences with the mailbox. And so he hadn't been able to deliver our mail. And so he said, "Stay there." And he ran to his mail truck and came back with piles and piles of mail and literally handed it to me in the street. And so when I passed it on to Father Don later that day, and he opened it up, most of the mail was checks that people had been sending from all around the country that, we had no expectation of receiving. And for me, that was a real kind of unexpected moment of abundance and blessing.
I would wholly agree with that. And I would have to say, this parish continues to amaze me, but really moved me deeply in the days and weeks after the fire. So the night of the fire, the one image that comes to my mind is this: the night of the fire, I finally got home quite late and I opened up my computer, which I probably shouldn't do, but I did. And an email thread was started that afternoon from a bunch of parishioners. So we have a community dinner here. And even though they had all lost their church that day, the first concern was, we have a community dinner next Sunday. How are we going to feed the people? And I still get emotional on this because I thought, here, people lost everything, but their concern and their care was to serve those in need. And they came together. It was so funny to watch us. They all came together, young and old. And even for liturgy that Sunday, when I had to tell you, I really had no idea what we were going to come to. And in fact, I was a bit anxious that weekend, thinking, oh, are we going to be able to pull this thing off? I mean, we didn't know if we'd have power for mics and all that. But people from all over were coming together, and parishioners. The morning of, Bishop Kevin, Hannah, and I were standing in sort of this little nook of our hall, and it was like a flurry of people. One of our parishioners, his boyfriend runs a restaurant, so he brought a bunch of coffee. His boyfriend brought all this coffee from the restaurant, set up a table with pastries and coffee. It was like one of our matriarchs, Wendy, this beautiful woman. I mean, she was coming up to me and saying, "Father Don, you need to do X, Y, Z," and she would already have everything planned out for me. I realized at that point, it was a really fun experience, that all I needed to do was step back and let them at it. And so the riches were there. The riches were abundant. And that still remains true. This parish has a wonderful way of hospitality and care, and they continue to do that with people. And the abundance also came from other places as well, and I will say both ecumenical and interreligious. Some of the most moving letters of support I got, and I've kept on my desk here, are actually from our Jewish siblings. There were a couple of Jewish congregations that wrote me, and just deeply powerful, because they were showing themselves to be in solidarity with us. I have a Roman Catholic priest friend of mine. 2 days after the fire, or was it the day after the fire, I had a haircut planned. My partner joked with me. He said, "Oh, sure, you got a haircut just for the media." It was not for the media. I had a haircut planned, and I told Bishop Andrew, I said, "I'm sorry, I need an hour break," because it's a friend of mine who cuts my hair. And I said, "I need an hour break. I need to get away." And so I went down to to my buddy's place and was getting my hair cut, and a Roman Catholic priest friend of mine came in, and he was all very excited. He said, "Oh, Don, yeah, the Archbishop of Toronto has issued a message of support for you all." And I had no idea. And I don't know why that just struck me so deeply. Father Jeff, your community, how they responded, because prior to the fire, we were actually looking at doing a collaborative ministry, a shared sort of Anglican Orthodox ministry here. And I thought that was going to be all done with the fire, but instead, no. Holy Mary Bears Parish has risen up in incredible ways and are really a major stalwart of our community dinner. So the abundance was real, and it is still real. But to Hannah's point on the end, I have to admit, what's really struck me in a very powerful way is across the city. At first, it was a little bit unnerving for me. I was not used to the fact of I'd be waiting for a streetcar in cities, and people would come up and say, "Oh, you're Father Don," and I'm thinking, "Oh God, I don't." My partner started telling me to wear a baseball cap because he said you need to hide when you're in public. We can't go out to dinner anymore. But I went in, so you get a look at my personal life here. But I went to a bar one night, and the bartender looked at me. It's a bar that I go to occasionally, and the bartender looked at me and he said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. We've been worried about you. Here, let me give you a pint." And I don't know why that hit me so profound, because again, there was this sense of solidarity. People really cared. It was opening up conversations about faith and life in the most extraordinary of places. And to me, that's abundance. I, prior to the fire, the leadership team here, we were all wrestling with, how do you sustain such a historic building? And I don't think people fully realize the huge effort and the monetary commitment that it took to keep that building going. And the feeling that I used to say to the leadership team is I felt that we were always having to preserve this building, but never really able to do ministry. And now it's flipped. And that's been the greatest blessing, because yes, it's painful not to lose that church and not have all the resources that we need. But real ministry is taking place. Some of the best ministry of my life has unfolded in this place. I also have to say the abundance in our diocese. Parishes from across the diocese have been supportive. The bishops have been incredibly supportive, both on a personal level and also to the parish as well. The deanery, I think I have some of the best colleagues in the deanery who, Father Nathan Humphrey, who's the rector at St. Thomas over on Huron Street, once made a comment. It was at my induction. He made the comment, he said, we're not competing with each other. We're working together with each other. And that became so evident in the days after the fire that this deanery, we're in a very good deanery because we all work together. We all support each other. And sure enough, I mean, St. Thomas lent us a chalice. I told one of the servers, I said I was feeling uncomfortable with this chalice because it was I thought you were going to give me one of your simple ones. But they lent us this very fancy chalice, and the whole time I thought, oh dear God, why are you leaving this with us? It was this terror, but I thought that's a really profound gesture that they gave without question. They shared and saw the ministry of our church as being collaborative. And so many of them have invited me as well to be guest preacher, to be guest celebrant in their church. And wherever I go, people are very interested. They want to support, they want to be with us, even though they got their own challenges, yet they still want to walk with us. I think, yeah, this has been utterly amazing to me, how the resources come up, and they still do. They still make their way. Yesterday, I baptized a young baby, and the parents just, out of their grace, gave a very wonderful donation. And they said they were so grateful we were here and wanted to be a part of our ministry. And I just thought, wow, God is at work. New life is coming about here. So, yeah.
I think this has been amazing. In a few minutes, we want to turn over to have all of you ask questions, and I think also probably before we turn it over to you, we want to ask you a little bit about some of the what you see as a legacy, but maybe just a simpler sort of question. You've talked about drawing strength and inspiration and a sense of abundance from the congregation, from the community, from your colleagues. Are there when you're alone, are there narratives, are there biblical or narratives, or are there bits that you go back to that hold you or take you to the next step? A simpler sort of question, maybe, but
Well, I guess I'll go. I was giving Hannah the chance there. Um, well, the Psalms have actually really spoken to me. Of course, the one that we know, out of the depths of my heart, I cry unto thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. That has been, I don't know, keeping going through my head, as well as the one, O Lord, thou hast been a refuge from one generation to another. Though the earth was formed, before the earth was formed, thou were, there's, it's funny how the Psalms, pray them all the time with the office, how they've really informed. I will be honest, sometimes I feel like Moses in the Old, in the Old Testament, where it's not easy leading a community through a time such as this. And I think I made the comparison one Sunday. I said, I need all of you to help raise my arms because I can't do this on my own. I need an Aaron and a Miriam. I need that. So that, the meal scenes have also spoken to me, the road to Emmaus, because that's really what we're experiencing every Sunday is, people coming together around the Eucharistic feast and, sharing the banquet together. So all these are sort of the images words that come to me, I guess.
Yeah, I haven't ever really thought about this. So this is a new question. People often ask the same questions again and again, and this is nice to have a different question. I think what springs to my mind is Esther. And maybe it's because on my desk in front of me that I can see, I have a postcard that says, perhaps this is the moment for which you were created. And that's something I've always come back to, kind of the idea of for such a time as this, and what does it mean to be called, to have a vocation, to be living in the world in such a time as this. But I think particularly for me, because I was ordained to the priesthood 2 weeks before the fire at St. Anne's, that was such a special day, and for me the culmination of kind of an 11-year journey towards ordination. And then I presided at the table for the first and only time the following week in the church, and then the church was gone. And so I think so much of the fire and the trauma will kind of always be connected to my ordination. To me, those anniversaries will be so close together. And so I think I really had a literal baptism of fire of figuring out, like, what does it mean to be a priest in such a time as this? Which is still something I'm figuring out. But I think, yeah, it's made it very special for me every time I preside. And maybe that's always the case when you're a new priest, but I've really noticed that being special, of, yeah, being able to feed the people that I love and serve. But the other thing that has really become noticeable to me, which I don't remember noticing really before, is the doxology. We say it every week, and we said it together in the parking lot at the Easter Vigil. And I think one of the journalists wrote about how he hadn't been to church since childhood, but in that moment the words came back and he found himself saying the doxology along with everyone. But what I've noticed about it in recent months is the from generation to generation part, particularly looking out at congregants, some of who, one family in our church, their father was baptized at St. Anne's in the 1920s, and he's no longer with us, but literally the generations to generations that have served and loved that building and the neighborhood and the congregation. And then what it means to think about the generations that are to come, that that building doesn't exist in the way that it used to, but the church still does. And so I think every time I say that now, I kind of look around at the faces of the congregation and think about what it means to have ancestors and also to leave something for the future generations as well.
Thank you both. I think we will now open it up to everyone here. If you have any particular comments, questions, or further reflections on what we've been talking about this evening, maybe just raise your hand in the Zoom chat or make a wave with your hand if you like.
It's been a very profound evening, and I think sometimes pulling up questions to this conversation is a bit hard off the bat, as I think as we're processing and really marveling at how kind and how honest you are in doing this. But I see there's two. I saw Brian Galligan. You were the first hand I saw, so if we'll go there.
Okay, yeah, I'm a priest in the Niagara Diocese, and I hear too often kind of what Father Don was alluding to before. We were so busy looking after the building that there was hardly time to do any ministry. And some of our churches, our older churches, have become become museum keepers, and certainly there are many churches where I've served in where I've looked and thought, if only we could get rid of this building and maybe just build a more multifunctional building elsewhere with space for a parking lot, because they weren't built with parking lots, 150 years ago. We would be much better off. And I think that we can learn a lot from your experience, Father Don and Hannah. What you've experienced is the reality of what some of us feel, that some of these old churches are kept alive because people are so connected to the experience of being in that building and not necessarily the ministry that can emanate from that building.
If I may add, I think just before, and I appreciate your comment, Brian, I think if I may add, it's so funny, in the months leading up to the fire, I was working closely with the diocesan property director and Mac Moreau. And we were already, and even Father Jeff, you're familiar with this as well, because Father Jeff and I were talking about this too, is rethinking of how we were using the church space, because it always bothered me that we had this very large space, but it would seem empty most of the time. So Mac and I were even exploring things of, and even the wardens and I, do we remove the pews? Do we make adjustable seating? Because since I've been here, I've been talking to our MP and our MPP, and they've all been desperate for some community space. Well, could we provide that? Now, of course, the fire changed that direction, but it's still a part of the conversation. But yeah, totally. We were trying to figure out, how do we capitalize on the space much more than just simply allowing it to be a museum piece, most of the time.
Andrea?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. It's been very informative, and I've learned a lot about what you've been through and what's in store for the church. This may have been answered already, but I'm wondering about Reverend Beyers, your comment about how it's important for the church to be representative of the community that it serves. And going forward, are there any plans for the church to consult with the community, not necessarily the church members themselves, but the greater community, to sort of get their ideas and visions for what they would like to see come to fruition?
Absolutely. And that's been from day one, I'll say. Because again, my predecessor did a really good job in connecting the church to the community. And so it's been our goal, our being the leadership team, myself, our architect, the discernment committee, that we are going to be working very closely with the local community. We're, in fact, in the next few months, going to be launching a number of town halls with different community members, different organizations. We're fortunate we have a strong partnership with Loft Community Services, which has, well, the church gave them a building here on campus. And because of that, even having conversations with some of our ministry partners like Loft, and some of the other organizations that we work with, of how could we're not just thinking of a church building, we're thinking the entire campus. How can this campus be of a resource to you? And this is also with, again, government officials, our MP and MPP and city councilor, all three of them. I've had multiple conversations, and they're very interested in being a part of that, both in ways of support, but also how can this whole campus better serve. And in terms on another side too, again, really turning to some of the local artists as well, and to some of the people in the community, as Hannah rightly pointed out, is a very diverse community, incredibly diverse. So this is an opportunity. I think I shared this once with the bishops. I think this is an opportunity for us to do something right as a church, for reconciliation. How can, with the indigenous community, but also with other groups that have been marginalized and disenfranchised by the church over the years. And Hannah, you illustrated that so well with the visual, in her experience as well. So yeah, we have a lot. This is not something somebody said, so when are you going to start building? And I said, well, this is going to take a while. There's a lot of effort that goes into this thing,
Patricia.
Many years ago in Saskatoon, our parish church, St. James, burned, and the walls were still standing. So the building was going to be reconstructed within those walls. But for about 6 months, they worshipped at the chapel of the College of Emmanuel in St. Chad, which had kind of a different and more open configuration. And really the exciting time was it allowed the congregation a chance to envision something different. And I think the end result was more functional and probably more attractive, but based on their experience of having to look at the other expressions and see how that worked. So it turned out all right. The fire did happen the night before I was to preach at the church. I didn't preach very often, and I thought, oh, sometimes people will go to enormous lengths not to hear me preach.
I appreciate you sharing your comment about the space, because, and Hannah, maybe because you spoke about this earlier, and I'm hoping Hannah will jump in here, but so the church was lovely to worship in. The only problem is Anglicans are very good and they'd all sit in back. So sometimes I felt like I was preaching across a football field, to a few people. But you said, Patricia, you said something very interesting in your comment there, and I heard it on Christmas Eve. So we've taken a different approach with our sanctuary in that the altar is center. And in fact, the discernment committee has agreed that whatever we build is going to have a Eucharistic focus, but that the table will be central in it. And on Christmas Eve, some neighbors came to the late mass, and they came up to me afterwards and they said, we like the other church, but we like this better because we can see other people's faces. And they felt very intimately connected to the table and to the Eucharist. And I know I feel that personally, like when it comes to the words of institution, I'm very intentional, and I look, and it's not gimmicky, I mean it. I look in people's faces and I say, take this, for this is my body given for you. Like I'm looking at them because this is Christ giving himself to us. So having that space, it's a very different experience than say what we had before. And I think it's allowed people to enter into the Eucharistic liturgy in a much more profound and deeper way in ways that I probably wasn't expecting. I'm curious to hear what Hannah has to say, because I think you've seen this.
Yeah, I agree. I think I grew up in the kind of church tradition that where the building doesn't necessarily look like a church anyway. So for a number of years when I was a student, I went to a church that met in a room above a Blockbuster Video. And so what's been interesting to me is being in this theatre space that doesn't have all those kinds of church, like sacred space trappings that we associate with big steeple churches, and yet still doing the full Anglican formal liturgy. It's a really interesting juxtaposition, because I've been in those spaces where you have like a rock band on stage playing, and then, you know, in a big steeple church you expect to have the choir and the processional and robes, and so to mix those together is a really, I guess it's another way of queering things. It's a really interesting thing to hold in tension, and to notice how the worship feels different in that space, and what parts work really well and what parts don't so much. And I think the other thing that I've really learned from being in that space, the first week that we went in, we just set up all the chairs in rows like you would for the theatre. And then I went on vacation for a couple of weeks, and when I came back, Father Don and some others had reordered all the chairs so that it's now more church in the round, and people can see each other, and the altar is more in the center rather than the front. And to just have the flexibility to be able to experiment with things like that is so much harder in a church building where you have pews already bolted to the floor. And so I think it will affect what is newly built will look different because of the time that we've spent in this new space as well.
Just pick up on the Indigenous reconciliation piece for a moment, because the old church and campus had an Indigenous garden, and one of the few places where a sacred fire could be held, you know, within the city limits. What's the current status of that, and what are the plans? I mean, Hannah's already spoken about looking forward to things growing again, and hopefully some gardening can take place, but is that part of the plans in the immediate future?
We certainly want to have something apart. I think that, how do I say, if I had a chance to go back in time, that was one thing that I would have us redo differently. Unfortunately, the garden has been a source of great pain for many, because some of you may not know, there was a real fear that the north wall of the church was going to collapse. And unbeknownst to the wardens, Hannah and myself, the demolition crews, the fire crews, went back into that space and essentially completely tore out all the trees, bushes, and everything. And I didn't know about it until late one night. I got an email and somebody sent a picture showing the devastation. And it was heart-wrenching to people. Heart-wrenching. Hannah can speak to this much more than I can. And it felt quite helpless, and it felt like a major step back in truth and reconciliation for those that were so connected to it. Because the perception is that we as leadership allowed this to take place. And the truth of the matter was, I had no idea. None of us had any idea. And so it's been a source of great pain and difficulty. The discernment committee and all of us are very much committed to having to cultivating and renewing that garden, and to working with our Indigenous partners for that. But there's going to take some considerable healing, you know. And I have to say, and I want to hand this over to Hannah, because Hannah has been probably one of the most gracious, compassionate, and caring ministers in this whole experience, and has personally, I think, just from what I've heard, really have felt that pain. And I think that's going to inform what we do next. So Hannah, I hope you don't mind, I'm putting you on the spot there.
That's fine. Yeah, I think I would echo what Don has said. It's I think the destruction of the sacred garden and the medicine plants the kind of desecration of that sacred space in the days following the fire has been one of, if not the most traumatic, distressing parts of this whole situation. There was a dedicated small group of people who had lovingly tended to that garden for many years. And I ran into one of them in the coffee shop the day after the fire, and we were looking at pictures that I'd taken from the top of the tower block next door on the evening of the fire, which showed the destruction of the church and seemingly miraculous survival of all of the plants and trees and green space and their sacred garden. And then a couple of days later, that was destroyed by the bulldozers. And so kind of walking alongside that group of people and holding space for the real rage and grief and distress was one of the most difficult things to witness, I think, for me in the days and weeks after the fire. And the group worked together to create a really beautiful vigil, kind of celebration of life, condolence ceremony, a real mixed service. Maybe service isn't the right word, but ceremony to honor and pay respect to the garden. And really that's all gone now. They were able to rescue some of the plants and move them to other locations, but what that will look like going forward is an open question, really. But I think it really solidified for me, as someone that's relatively new to Canada, I've only been here 5 or 6 years, the added layers of grief and trauma that Indigenous people have suffered that is beyond anything that I can understand from my own lived experience. And that, again, every time trauma happens, it re-traumatizes people who are already traumatized. And I think I saw that the most with that group of people. And I also, on my notice board that I see every time I sit at this desk, I have all sorts of different quotes and things that I've picked up along the years. And I have one here that was from a class at Trinity. And it was the class about the Anglican Church and the history of the Anglican Church and Indigenous people in Canada. And at one point, the professor said this, and so I stuck it on my notice board: even your best attempts at being decolonial or post-colonial will still be colonial. This is the insidiousness of settler colonialism at work. Each of us can only do the work that we're called to do, and still we must do that work. And I think that's what I come back to again and again, is that, you know, we're gonna mess up if we try and do this work, and sometimes that's spectacular and causes a lot of harm, but each of us can only do the work that we're called to do, and still we must do this work.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that almost, it feels like a bit of a more somber tone than we've given for the whole evening, but maybe it's an important and poignant place to land, you know, about doing the work we're called to do, and your recollection earlier of Esther, right, about being appointed for a time such as this. And I mean, I think I can speak on behalf of us all that the two of you have been extraordinarily inspiring to us all, not just this evening, but I mean, for the last 9 months. Even before that, we knew that about you, but you were called for a time such as this, and I can't think of two better examples of people putting in the work that they're called to do. And so on behalf of everyone I know, thank you for that, and thank you for taking time this evening to be with us all, and to give us sense of the kinds of resources and strengths that we can turn to. We may not be living through the same level of crisis, but we all of us, you talked about that earlier, we all have struggles in our parishes, in our families, in our communities, and I think you've taught us something pretty important tonight about how we can carry on as people of resurrection, as Don had said. So thank you both.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Bishop Kevin has his hand up, so we'll just give him for a moment.
I apologize for jumping in after the thank you. And I'm just here as a participant and a Trinity alum and a member of the Divinity Associates, and just very happy to be here. I think I would say that as the Bishop for St. Anne's and someone who has sort of a unique vantage point of how things have unfolded over the past 9 months, Jeffrey, I would really want to echo your words. I think that the leadership that Don and Hannah, that the two of you have given, and your church wardens and lay leaders in the community and people in the broader community has just been so inspirational. And, you know, Jeffrey, you asked the question earlier about biblical images and tethering this trauma to the narrative, to the theological and biblical narrative. And I was there that Sunday, that first Sunday when we worshiped in the parking lot. And Dawn, and you, Hannah, were there, and you talked about the various pieces that had been borrowed, a chalice from St. Thomas's and of, you know, vestments from another parish. And the media was still all there because it was the Sunday after the fire. And I drove home that day thinking that the media probably took away from that. Oh, look, well, you know, when there's a crisis, churches chip in and help each other. But for us, I think there's just a much deeper and more profound truth about that. That, you know, I think of that image of St. Paul from 1 Corinthians about the body. You know, we have need of one another, and it was a much more significant thing than helping each other out. There was a deep theological truth or set of theological truths that was being spoken and displayed in that moment as the church gathered. And I believe the church, past and present, you know, temporal and celestial, like there was a sense of great continuity being there, even in the disruption and the trauma of that Sunday. And I'll never forget that. I think it was a tremendously moving moment for me to know that the church was gathered in a much more significant way than the 60 or 70 or 80 people that were there that Sunday in the parking lot. Anyway, that's enough from me, but just to echo on behalf of the diocese and the College of Bishops, our profound thanks for how you have served the people of St. Anne's and how you continue to do so. And not only St. Anne's, but the wider community as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to add one more set of thanks. It's really on behalf of the Divinity Associates, the Faculty of Divinity and Reimagining Community Ministries. You all were there when we had that vision to leap off with this idea of church outside the walls, to have profound conversations, continuing conversations that were really looking at ways in which the Spirit was in the world. And for our opening event, you the hospitality and the friendship that you offered, and the hosting of that event was more than we could have asked or imagined. And to have you back here to add to this conversation that has, over the past almost year now, been wide-ranging and at times profound, and just really take it again to another level. And I thank you on behalf of all the groups, the Divinity Associates and the faculty and Reimagining Ministry for trusting us, for giving us your time, and for the very great privilege to hear from you both. And it's been a tremendous evening. I hope that many people we're going to send out lots of information so that those people who weren't able to be here tonight will be able to view it. And I suspect there are those amongst you like me who will want to go back and look at the recording and really take in some of this very inspiring and profound conversation. On a less inspiring but practical way, but what we hope will also offer food for thought. We are continuing our conversations. We going to have to just say, watch this space. We have a couple of plans as we go into the latter part of spring, and there'll be some events, some notifications of some events that will be coming up. We are having a meeting, in fact, tomorrow, so more will be forthcoming, but do watch for that. We traditionally, the Divinity Associates have traditionally had a one-day conference in May. because we've understood over the course of this year, and because we want to continue this conversation of church outside the walls in an ongoing way, we're going to delay that conference. I think it will be in September. We're finalizing that, but it'll be a chance to, as we come back together, we'll have some things going into the summer, but as we come back in the new academic year and as for our new work years and our new church years, that we'll be able to really revisit some of these conversations and take a deep dive into some of the issues that have arisen and will continue to arise. So do continue to check the Trinity website. We'll continue to send you information, and as I say, watch your calendars, because there's some events coming up in April and May. In the meantime, thank you very much to all of you, and thanks to all who've organized it. We were absolutely delighted that you could be here, and thank you, Don, and thank you, Hannah. It was very special. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.